of our Habitat series, which is a reporting series that's made possible with support from the Real Estate Foundation of BC. You can read all the stories for Habitat on our website. We just published one this morning that we're going to talk about today. And just before we get started, I want to mention that the Narwhal is committed to upholding the principles of truth and reconciliation. So I want to acknowledge that I'm a guest on the lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Specifically, I live just a little bit north of Statlow, or what's recently known in English as the Fraser River, on the homelands of the Musqueam people. My family comes from the Cree Nation in the prairies in Treaty 6, and my ancestors also come from Sweden, Germany, and Scotland. If you'd like to share where you're coming from and what Indigenous nations you call home, we'd love to hear that in the chat. All right. A little bit about the Narwhal, just in case you're new. We're a 7-year-old digital publication. We focus on in-depth and investigative reporting about the natural world in Canada. And while this conversation is focused on housing and climate in BC, and that's where I'm located, as well as our 2 reporters today, we also have teams in the prairies and in Ontario. Also, just want to mention that the Narwhal is a reader-supported publication, so we're supported by more than 7,000 members. And thank you to anyone here who's a member today. For those of you who aren't, if you join today, you will get a very exciting new Narwhal tote bag. Look how beautiful. It's a special thank you if you join the Narwhal. And speaking of members, we do have a little poll that might pop up to tell us so we can see who here today is a member. I'm just going to take a minute to fill it in. All right, just a couple more housekeeping notes and then we're going to get to the good stuff. The session is being recorded. It will be available for viewing online after the event, so look out for an email tomorrow with the recording. We are providing automated closed captioning if anyone would like to use that. So to turn it on, go to the control panel at the bottom of your screen and select the arrow next to the CC icon. You can also select caption settings to control the size of the captions, and you should be able to move the caption box anywhere around your screen. If you have any trouble, you can ask questions in the chat. We do have a few members in the Narwhal team monitoring that today. And just a big thank you to everyone who submitted questions in advance. We did receive more than 100 questions in advance, so we're going to try and get to as many as we can during this chat. I'll be asking Steph and Shannon some questions. They're going to tell you a bit about their reporting, and then we will have time for your questions at the end. So just a little bit about the series we're talking about today, Housing and the Climate Connection, our series Habitat. It's a series that was really inspired by the housing crisis and the climate crisis, 2 intersecting issues that we think about a lot. Here in BC, we've witnessed quite a few really devastating climate disasters in just the last few years, including 2 deadly floods, a heat dome, and wildfire seasons that are just getting longer and more severe. We're still in the midst of the 2nd worst one on record right now. So as we're thinking about solving the housing crisis and building housing that's accessible, healthy, and affordable, we also need to be thinking about housing that is adapted for the futures and realities of living in a time of climate change. Things like wildfire smoke, extreme heat, heavy rain, these are all things that housing has to grapple with in BC and beyond. And housing also needs to be built with consideration for the natural world, and our imperiled environment. So thinking about things like wildlife corridors, the impact of urban sprawl, declining green space, those are also issues in consideration in this series. So those are really big problems, and the reporting that Steph and Shannon are here to talk about includes some really hopeful solutions. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves to you today, and they will tell you a little bit about the stories that they reported for Habitat that we're going to discuss now.
Tannoyap, Kwetásel'wet, Kweanka Shaman, Stephanie Kweansna, Tinachin Tla, Astahan Ohomeo. Hello everyone, really great to see where everyone's from in the chat. My official name is Kwetásel'wet, my English name is Stephanie, and I am joining you from Estla'an. This is on the north shore of Vancouver, just near Lonsdale Quay. And yeah, I'm one of the BC reporters with the Narwhal, living and reporting here from our territory. So happy to be here with you. Over to you, Shannon.
Hi, I'm Shannon Waters. I am over in Victoria on the traditional territory of several First Nations, the Lekwungen peoples, and the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and WSÁNEĆ. I am the BC politics reporter for the Narwhal, so most of my reporting, including the two stories for this series, had a bit of a focus on government policies and how they affect the situations that we find ourselves faced with every day.
Thanks, Shannon. Thanks, Steph. To start, Shannon, I think we're going to touch on one of your stories, which is about social housing and some surprising things that you learned during reporting about how social housing is actually ahead of the game when it comes to building for the climate.
Yeah, I really enjoyed reporting this story, partly because having covered housing policy and just the depth of the crisis in BC, it can be a bit bleak sometimes. So it was nice to be talking to people and organizations who have benefited from social housing that is also climate resilient housing, and we're working to build more of it. And one of the themes that emerged from the folks that I was talking to who were working in the nonprofit and social housing space is that there's a lot of interest there in building climate resilient housing. And that has kind of pushed the sector, according to some of the folks that I spoke to the cutting edge of building housing that is both affordable for British Columbians of all economic backgrounds and experiences, and that is going to be, cool in the summer, that can provide clean air, that is warm in the winter, that is energy efficient, sort of all of the things you're looking for in a climate solution. Um, and part of the reason for that is financial, as you might expect. Um, Despite kind of the perception that if you're going to be building to higher standards, some of you might be familiar with like the Passive House standard, which is kind of the most extreme or high level when it comes to things like energy efficiency and being what's the term for when basically being like not airtight, but able to keep out the atmosphere and also keep in things like heat. There's a perception that doing that is always very expensive, and so it's not a good option when you're trying to build affordable housing. But what folks who are working at building affordable housing and nonprofit social housing told me was that actually it is worth, like, one, it's not always more expensive. It can be. That depends on sort of a variety of parameters. But you can build housing that is sort of on the cutting edge of the climate solution for about the same as traditional builds in many cases. And also, because the nonprofit sector is often working with longer timelines to recoup their costs versus a for-profit model where they're often trying to, sort of make a profit as quickly as possible on housing, that those investments actually end up making more sense for their bottom line because they're looking to a longer term vision. And if you're going to have a building that has a life cycle of 50 years or more, you really want to be building for the climate that we might find ourselves in 50 years, which kind of gets back to the bleakness a little bit. But generally I found this story was sort of really encouraging and uplifting to report.
It's a very uplifting story. And I think the considerations you raise around cost and the kind of challenges sometimes of building housing is a great lead into talking about one of Steph's stories for the series that she reported from the Heiltsuk Nation, which their central village, Bella Bella, is quite a remote community. And so the challenges of building housing there are logistically quite intimidating, but they have a really ambitious housing vision for the nation.
Yes, I got to go up to Bella Bella earlier this year, which was a really, really, really special opportunity to get to do that. I've done a lot of reporting on Heiltsuk from afar, and finally got to go there and see some of what they're doing. And Heiltsuk is trying to take a very long-term and holistic approach to addressing housing issues. The chief, Marilyn Slett, said if you went up to anyone in the community and asked for their top concern, they'd probably say housing. And I feel like that's something so many communities can relate to. And as they're trying to meet the immediate need, which is that they're hundreds of houses behind, hundreds of people on the housing list, again, something that's in a lot of communities, and they're trying to meet that basic immediate need. At the same time, they're trying to create a long-term plan and build housing that reflects their values and are culturally safe as well. So things like sea level rise, seasonal flooding, heat waves, and wildfires are all getting more extreme, the same as up in their territory, and they're trying to build housing that can be resilient to that. And partnering with a variety of different entities from the province and the feds, and also to universities, banks, foundations, all different kinds of partnerships to get this kind of work done. And a big part of it is also, again, that cultural safety piece. So building up programs in the community, building up community infrastructure, building up clean energy. Over the winter, the community still experiences a lot of power outages, and that still relies on a diesel generator. And for them, climate change is a high concern, particularly the territory is a high concern. So they're exploring hydrogen, geothermal, tidal energy, all different kinds of energy. And they have a decades-long climate plan of how to bring the community to that place. And that's what a hereditary chief said. We might be making a smaller impact just due to the size of our community, but we want to walk the talk and we want to find ways that align with our ways of being. They also built a women's shelter that serves a variety of nations in the area. And again, like cultural safety is really integral to that, and addressing the context of the intergenerational trauma people are dealing with. And that was a really high priority in the community. And so that was something that they completed just last year. It's almost ready to let people actually live in there. It's all built and they're setting it up. And I was there and it was a really, really beautiful, peaceful space. So yeah, what really stuck out to me was just how much it wasn't just building rooms, and it wasn't such a siloed approach. It was that all of this is connected. Our clean energy plan is connected. Our jurisdictional plans are connected, asserting our rights and title and our housing plan. All of these things are tied together. And that was really central to them creating the plan that they have.
Yeah, I love that story, I think, because it shows how things like energy and housing are really interconnected, and Heiltsuk is taking quite an innovative approach in considering them simultaneously and holistically. Something that wasn't a part of the series, but you can read about in our previous reporting, was the city of Vancouver looking at whether to reintroduce the natural gas heating into new builds, which was like kind of a controversial issue here last fall. And I think is just a reminder that you can't really think about how we're building housing without thinking about energy. And it's something we'll be doing more reporting on in the next few months, so keep an eye out. The Heiltsuk story is also a reminder, I think, that communities, every community in Canada and everywhere is impacted by climate change, but the immediate effects of that can look different, and at times they can be unpredictable. So a coastal community like Heiltsuk is thinking about sea level rise. Here in the Lower Mainland, one of the biggest and most impactful outcomes of climate change has been flooding. And I know both of you have covered the question of what to do after a disaster like a major flood, and how to respond. So Shannon, do you want to start by telling us a bit about your story that looks into the costs and questions of rebuilding after a disaster?
Sure. So that was the second piece that I reported on for this series. And just going back to what Steph was saying about the interconnectedness of housing policy, that was something that came up in the piece that I wrote about what to consider and what the costs are of rebuilding after disasters. I spoke to an academic from the University of BC who works in a lab where they're basically trying to develop algorithms and systems for assessing the long-term benefits and potential pitfalls of various government policies, including helping the federal government do a first of its kind assessment of all of the federal infrastructure that needs to be upgraded or maintained or built out, or like it's kind of a mind-blowing project. And you can't have housing without the appropriate infrastructure. Whether you're densifying and need to build capacity, or whether you are looking at expanding communities and need to build more infrastructure. You need power for homes. You need transportation options, ideally ones that don't force people to rely on individually owned vehicles. So you need like transit options. You need sewers. You need to be able to manage your water. Like you can't just build a house or a multi-unit building and that's it at the end of the day. And that is something that to date, governments and communities have not been great at, is looking at sort of like bigger pictures and how to plan for the future. And one of the questions that came up in the story that I was reporting is, one, how do we better assess that big picture so that we can be better prepared for the climate intensified disasters that we have been seeing in recent years. But there's another question behind that, which is, when do you not consider rebuilding? Like, basically, when do you walk away? When do people have to realize that they can't go home? They're going to have to go somewhere else. And we've started to see that in BC already in sort of various aspects. I was talking to a woman who lived in Grand Forks and had her property expropriated and wasn't able to go home. She actually ended up leaving BC because she couldn't find anywhere that she wanted to live that she could afford to live by the time the expropriation process was complete. My sense, after querying a couple of government ministries how they are assessing parameters for it's often called managed retreat, when you're actually trying to proactively say, okay, we can't live in this area anymore, it's like too flood prone or it's too exposed to potential wildfires or whatever the case may be. I didn't get really much of an answer from the government ministries about what it is that they're doing to actually look at areas in BC where we may need to start considering managed retreat in the future. Because one of the things that came out of Grand Forks was a lot of people, despite the fact that the Grand Forks had flooded multiple times over the years. Many of these people were aware that like they couldn't get flood insurance. They had been flooded multiple times, but they still felt, or many of them still felt, a bit blindsided when they were told, no, we're expropriating your property. We're going to give you a sum of money and you are going to have to go and live somewhere else. So it's kind of there's a tension, I think, between sort of taking a longer view and preparing people for something that they may have to consider a few years from now or a decade from now, versus, okay, we've had one too many natural disasters in this area, this neighborhood has burned down again, has flooded again, and people are just not going to be able to go home. And I think that is a conversation that many levels of government and communities are kind of a bit behind on, given what we've already seen both in BC and across Canada.
Thanks for that, Shannon. And Steph, I know you also did a story recently about rebuilding after disaster that looks at a different kind of disaster, but you've also written about the idea of managed retreat, and I feel like you've gotten a kind of different perspective on it too. Do you want to talk a bit about your reporting on this in the past?
Yeah. I also wrote about managed retreat, in particular about the flooding in BC and the lower mainland and Sumas Prairie. A lot of overlap with Shannon's work. And yeah, it's a very tough conversation for people to have. You bring up managed retreat, it's really scary for some folks. And for others, it's less scary because there's already been an immense amount of change in this area, and it's more about looking at the way that the land is behaving and working with it instead of against it. And some of it is looking at just the upright costs and doing more research into that. Like one report was looking at the cost of trying to keep preventing the natural flow of water in Sumas Prairie indefinitely versus buying out property and relocating people, and finding that it actually could potentially be cheaper to do that in the long run. But again, for some people, that's a very scary, challenging idea to get to that place. And then in other circumstances, there's not always the resources available to make houses resilient. or they're just not being allocated. So, for example, with the Sumas area, with the Lower Mainland, BC told the Fraser Current it just is facing too many demands that it doesn't have the money required to actually make all of the upgrades it would need to address more extreme flooding in the Lower Mainland. Like they just fully said that to the Fraser Current. We have too many other competing priorities. We can't do it. While having the knowledge that more destructive flooding in the Lower Mainland could be a $20 billion to $30 billion disaster, that the flood that happened were already one of the costliest disasters that BC's ever experienced, and that families are still waiting on disaster payments years later. Like this is all already happening, but it can still, I think it's just like a mental thing. It can feel like a future problem, but it's something that already happened and is currently happening. And so, yeah, that is a very tense conversation to be had to even open up the idea of that. And then again, when there's not always the financing available, that can make it really hard to rebuild appropriately. Like Lytton came up with this idea to build back Fire Smart, Lytton, the community in BC that burned down due to wildfires. And then a few years later was like, it's just not financially viable for us actually to build an 100% Fire Smart community. And individuals can't always access the financing required to make their house resilient to floods or fires when they have to pay the upfront cost. And so there's just this huge gap in what we know is required and what's available, and even just the human emotional element of making those immense changes.
I feel like living on this massive earthquake fault line in this part of British Columbia, this is really a place to find by not thinking about the long-term costs of inaction and trying to put those out of mind. It's our provincial ethos.
So human.
Extremely human. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about your other building back after a disaster story, which also intersects with some of the challenges around costs of building houses for these kinds of climate concerns.
The story we just put up today was one that was so exciting to learn about. So there was really destructive fires in Silcote territory, the interior of BC back in 2017. And it was, it was really rough for the community, caused a lot of destruction. And the former chief of one of the communities, Unisatine, Russell Myers Ross, he already kind of had this idea that he wanted to build a house that was resilient to wildfires. And he began working with UBC, University of British Columbia, and their School of Architecture on this design. And they've been working on it since before 2017, and just yesterday released some videos of the prototype that they've designed that they put a ton of thought into of what a wildfire resilient house can look like. And again, it's really culturally informed. Traditional pit houses in the area were round and set in the ground to keep everything cool and sheltered. And this house is also set in the ground, and it's still square to be easier building, but there's pillars around the outside, a central skylight, and a central stove to kind of like create the central heart to emulate those traditional homes. There's an outdoor kitchen, an outdoor fire pit, an outdoor smokehouse. The outdoor space was really important, but it's also built with it's kind of simple, elegant technologies that are more resilient. So a white metal roof that deflects heat and is also won't catch fire from embers, sprinklers pointing at the walls. Berry bushes are around the house, which are actually deterrent to embers versus a lot of other vegetation that's really flammable. And there's a heat pump. It's like mold resistant. It has a really efficient seal. It's almost at passive house level. And again, the idea of outdoor space and indoor space, that cultural element is really central to it. And yeah, John Bass, the architect, and Russell Myers Ross, who created it, together, they're saying it's not really that outlandish price-wise. These are things that are very accessible. These technologies are very accessible. It's just about actually getting these new homes out there. It's often been, unique challenges for reserves to get access to these resources. But yeah, they have this prototype, but they're also just looking for a funder to help them build it to show that this kind of house is possible and can be replicated in a lot of different contexts.
What I love about that story is it it really shows how like historically, communities built housing that was adapted for their local climate, their local ecosystem, not just through the design elements, but also things like the berry bushes, like the plants that were cultivated around housing. Um, and how much housing in the province and everywhere now is kind of dislocated from those realities. So both as a historic artifact and I think as a sort of globalization maybe of housing styles. So here in Vancouver, there's a lot of housing that's just not built for extreme heat because that's a recent concern here. And a lot of these projects are thinking like not just what are the concerns now, but like what are the climate changes in the future, which are, in BC's interior, almost certainly going to be more extreme wildfires to anticipate.
Yeah, another just quick note on that is that's a perfect reference to, again, the holistic approach. The other thing that Russell is always working on is bringing back cultural burning in the territory, which was the way that the nation's always historically managed fires by getting rid of fuel on the forest floor so that they wouldn't be so destructive, a practice that was outlawed and now it's just being revitalized. So on the one hand, they're creating this house, and on the other hand, also bringing back the cultural burning to mitigate the impact of fires in the area.
Yeah, definitely. There's a theme in a lot of this reporting on kind of not fighting nature necessarily, but understanding and adapting to it. And that's present in your reporting on the Sumas River and Sumas Nation, which, historically it was a lake and it was the effort to kind of, I guess, transform that region into farmland that is one of the challenges now is trying to fight against what nature is naturally inclined to do. So I think there's always some interesting lessons, both when we're looking to the future for what housing should be, but also thinking about the past as well and that whole concept. I want to ask you both, when you're reporting these stories, I mean, we don't do a lot of reporting on housing specifically as an environmental publication. What's something really interesting that you learned while reporting? What's one fun nugget that didn't make it into your stories necessarily?
I think, of course, I knew at a level that these were connected, but it really brought it into focus, I think, for me to listen to so many people talk about the connection. Because again, like one of the questions that the audience submitted that we were considering was, how do you even talk about things like climate change? And again, something that can feel big and far away when people have such immediate concerns like housing. So to speak to so many people who are on the front lines of this and have them put it into words was just really, really helpful. Like for example, Marilyn, the chief of Heiltsuk, said, like housing is a human right and ensuring people have adequate housing that's appropriate for the threats that are coming is essential. Like just put it so clearly in such a helpful way. And to get a better understanding again of like what ideas are here and versus what resources are available and that gap and how people are trying to think about filling that gap, but we really are just in that place of meeting that gap. I think all of that just became a lot more clear to me and actually easier for me to communicate from speaking to so many people who are thinking about this all the time.
For sure. Shannon, what comes to mind for you?
So after reporting on the sort of how to assess when to build back after disasters, I ended up going back to some documents that I had FOI'd, which had to do with BC's emergency management minister expressing some concerns to the former federal Liberal government about plans for a national flood insurance program. And I ended up doing a different story, another story about the conversation around national flood insurance, which is still moving ahead in Canada. We are supposedly probably getting some kind of national flood insurance program for high-risk properties next year. I think April 2026 is roughly the timeline that the feds are still working with. And there was a lot of consensus that like this is needed. We need the federal government to be involved in flood insurance for these high risk properties where people live, but that it needs to be designed very carefully to avoid something called moral hazard, which would essentially be, in this case, providing people who live in high risk areas, flood prone areas, with insurance without any kind of requirement that they or their communities take steps to reduce that risk where possible. And then another component of that kind of dovetails with the housing crisis is, the federal government is encouraging more, increases in the housing supply, more building, and making sure that those homes are not going to be built in places that are flood prone, ideally, also not fire prone, et cetera. But in this context, we're talking specifically about flooding. And really, I think the thing that kind of I took away from that reporting on that story was that, one, it has to be like a whole of government approach. It has to be the federal governments, it has to be the provincial governments, it has to be local governments, everyone who's involved in sort of the policy making around communities. And the big question that the province was asking, just to go back to those documents that I FOI'd, was who's going to pay for this and how much is it going to cost us? Because right now, a lot of the direct costs when catastrophic flooding happens are borne by the federal government through their disaster financial assistance program. That program, as it has existed, it's in the process of being reformed, basically would hand out money to people who had experienced flooding in their homes and communities. That would be distributed through provincial and local governments, but there wasn't any kind of strings to that. No requirements to, take some steps to reduce flooding. And that is one of the major pitfalls of that program that a lot of the folks that I talked to really wanted to see avoided in the federal program. The question now being, like, many provincial governments are likely going to be expected to contribute to this federal program in a way that they don't currently do. And one of the things that came through in the documents that I got from the BC government was that there was an interest in understanding what the provincial responsibilities were likely to be under a national flood insurance program. So that's something that I'm still thinking about and that I will be watching for when we hopefully get some details on what a national flood insurance program is going to look like in Canada starting next year.
Thanks, Shannon. I think something that really comes through for housing, which is true of any big complicated issue that affects anyone in Canada, is that it requires interventions and cooperations from every level of government, from provincial and federal to like municipal and First Nations level governments. There has to be collaboration to solve these problems. We always love knowing about this collaboration. So please ask the government to answer our questions and respond to our interview requests when we send them. That would be great. Because it is, I think we think about areas that are like flood prone and fire prone, but something that I think this wildfire season has really reminded me is there is no part of this world that is exempt from the impacts of climate change. Like, this is a wildfire season where we've seen incredible impacts in the Atlantic provinces, more than ever in the northern prairies. Northwest Territories had devastating wildfires in 2023. Like, there is no part of the planet that is sort of safe. And so I hope as provinces and territories and federal governments are thinking about their responsibilities, they remember that this is coming for everybody. We have to have solutions that work for all of us. I want to give some time now to the amazing questions that people submitted. So thanks again for sending us questions ahead of time, and for submitting questions in the chat. I'm going to start with one that we got ahead of time from Chelsea. If you're here, Chelsea, thanks for submitting this question, which is, how do we keep the conversation with our neighbors and politicians focused on climate when everyone is so desperate for housing? So how do we make sure that housing conversations include climate as a consideration? I think you both touched on this, but I'd be interested to hear what you think.
Do you have any initial thoughts, Shannon?
I think sort of what comes to mind for me initially with that is that it needs to be an and conversation, not an either or conversation. So one thing that I see a lot when governments are developing and implementing policies is talk about constraints, cost constraints and time constraints. And obviously, those are real challenges that do have to be met. But going back to when is it worth it to rebuild versus walk away? Um, all of that is sort of interconnected, and so are climate resilient and climate friendly policies and housing policy. And I think that pushing back against the we can either have this or we can have that, we can either do this or we can do that, is really important, and reminding elected officials that we really need to have, when it comes to housing, it needs to be climate resilient, and it also needs to be affordable, and it also needs to be accessible. Like, it has to be an and conversation, or we're going to find ourselves in really, like, either not addressing the housing crisis that we have been experiencing for years now, or potentially even seeing it worsen depending on the policies that we pick.
Yeah, I really like how you said it. I think I've just would expand on the same idea of sort of like reframing the same conversation because they are related and everyone feels very urgent about protecting their homes or accessing safe housing. Whether you're an owner and it's the biggest investment of your life, or you're a venture and feel literally no security and that you have no say in what happens where you live. Everyone could be facing extreme weather or natural disasters where they're living. And so when conversations about housing come up, um, bringing in those connections to climate, like insurance comes up and the climate change impacts on insurance, talking about density, right? That comes up all the time. And then you can bring up the impacts of urban sprawl on ecosystems, talking about what kinds of houses to build and energy efficiency and resiliency and clean energy, and just bringing all those elements into those conversations because they are related to affordability and safety, which is what everyone cares about. Whenever writing stories, and I try to think about, what's at the real core of this story, so often the idea of home is central to it, and it's something that everyone feels very deeply. And so kind of keeping that, I think, at the heart of the conversations. And as we've been talking about, that these things are already happening. And so bringing that to the forefront of those conversations around housing as well. Like, people already are in buildings that are too hot. That has already caused deaths. These things are happening now, like they're not potentials. I think is another way to kind of reframe the conversation. And then just really hearing how people are framing their concerns and, meeting them where they're at and bringing climate to that conversation of those concerns that people have.
Thanks for that, Steph and Shannon. Steph, I think reminding ourselves and our neighbors that these are concerns that are affecting us now. Like you said, during the heat dome in 2021 in BC, over 600 people died, many of them at home because they were in homes that became too hot. And, as this is a question about how we keep these conversations focused, I would say, in my experience reporting on housing for the Narwhal, looking at like city council processes here in Vancouver, local residents have a lot of influence in terms of how priorities are set with housing. We see the power of community members in every hearing on housing. And often those voices are used to change and shape proposals. They often bring out a lot of people who are concerned about changes in their neighborhood, and but you also hear people who are thinking about, the future residents of an area, the people who will live there. And to that end, I think, it's often hard to get politicians to think about climate. As Shannon and Steph have said, those are such long-term concerns that cost money to address. I think there's often political interest in keeping the focus on like short-term, immediate outcome kind of actions. But if you want your politicians and your community members to consider and care about climate and climate change in housing, it's a really good way to use your voice as a citizen to speak up about it, because you actually do have that influence, particularly at the local level. That's my stump speech for getting people to sign up to speak to their city councils. Here's a great question from Bethlehem. How can we make housing more climate friendly and accessible, especially for those who can't easily move or renovate? We've talked a lot about the costs. These are not easy or cheap solutions. So what are some things that people can do where they are to make their housing more climate resilient?
doing some research into what's available in your area, because that's one thing I learned too, is there's a huge variety across provinces and territories, and even at a very local level, what programs are available. And so finding out what is available in your area, are there upfront rebates or like later rebates? What is something that's actually feasible? Because again, like affordability is a huge part of it. Um, but doing a little bit of that research, like you said, advocating at all levels of government for these measures and for more financing to be available. And even as a renter, knowing what's available in your area and what you can push for where you're living, and what connections you can make are all big things that you can do. And while some of the fire smart and flood mitigation like technologies are a little bit more expensive, there are some that are also really approachable. So I guess just doing like a real deep dive into all of the things that are available. And then yeah, and then thinking of again, like we said, the short term, long term costs, because there was one story that we published recently. Let me quickly grab the author's name because I want to give Chloe Williams, looking at why there aren't more fire smart homes. And I found it fascinating that very few people have got assessments to become fire smart, 7,500 people across all of BC, and then of them, only 116 did the actions necessary to be certified as a fire smart house. I found that really fascinating. And so I guess also, once again, looking at the long term to short term, but again, so much of that comes back to advocating to government to make financing available, make things actually possible. I think so much of it comes back to what you were saying, Michelle, about like using your voice in these spaces to really advocate for these things and for the urgency of it, because public pressure is kind of how government decides something urgently needs to be addressed.
I think Steph covered that very thoroughly, so I don't have anything to add on that front.
Yeah. I just want to note in the chat, our assistant editor, Paloma, put a link to an essay we published in December by Mandy Lynn Catron that's about the importance of social connection too. Like, I think, we're talking a lot about costs and actual changes that individuals can make, but actually like gathering with your neighbors too is a really key thing, not only for having connections that you can draw on if you find yourself facing any kind of disaster at home, but also because collectively, I think we have more power to address these things. We can pool resources, we can look at community and neighborhood level changes. And I think it's a great read for those of you who want to look outside the Habitat series as well, to think about, tapping into networks beyond like our individual power, as well as what we can demand from our governments. Collective action is really powerful, and it can also be really uplifting. I think we've touched on this a little bit, but I just love this question so much that I think it'll give us a good time for reflection. So David asked, what's one thing I can do today to address this issue? Something someone could do directly after this webinar, after they have a snack.
I think it's really connected to what you just said about sharing this kind of information. Again, that social connection piece, and education, like amongst each other, information sharing with each other, at a really big level and at once again, that really hyper local level. Like you can see in the chat and in the questions we've gotten, people have a lot of really local knowledge about where they live that they can share. So I think that knowledge sharing is huge, about the different technologies, about the impacts. Yeah, I think like that conversation and that education with each other is huge. And also one thing that people brought up a lot in the reporting I did, especially for First Nations, a big thing is wanting to have some self-sufficiency locally to be able to build housing and use locally created resources. Using a local mill, local companies, that kind of thing. COVID-19 in particular really spotlighted the weaknesses of relying on these supply chains so heavily. And so finding out what is in your backyard in your area, and again, just like starting to, I guess, be part of building those connections as well. There's some really, really, really cool stuff going on that, again, is uplifting to find out about. There's partnerships between local companies and First Nations and foundations and universities happening all the time. I just got a press release about another similar one that was about a local First Nation, a local company getting together to use like undesirable timber and turn it into panels that they could use to build housing down the line. And they could create these panels over the winter so that they can build super fast in the summer. It was such a cool partnership. So I feel like there's a lot of stuff like that happening that can maybe even use people's support or, again, just the knowledge sharing element. So looking into what's happening at a local level, everyone was really emphasizing how important it is to have housing that reflects the specific community, not some big broad brush or cookie cutter kind of solution.
I think it's also like worth noting that not to be sort of like discouraged by thinking that, oh, like what can I do as an individual, or that the scale of your contribution is, you know, meaningless just because it's just you. Because again, with like the collective action thing, if there's lots of people taking these small steps, it can like make a big difference. I am a renter in Victoria. I moved this summer into a new home. And so one of the things that we have been doing as we've been settling in is like figuring out you know, ways to make sure that and it's kind of driven partly by, you know, economics, making sure that our heating bill when it gets cold is not going to be astronomical. So we've been looking at like getting the doors resealed, because one of them you can actually like see daylight under, which is not a good sign when you're talking about like a well-sealed home and where your heat is going to go in the winter, as well as while we've still been dealing with the summer heat, like what windows need really good window covering so that we're not getting a ton of heat during the summer, you know, the sunny days. We also installed a rain barrel, which I personally love because it makes it easier to water my garden. And yeah, so just like I find it can be pretty empowering just to take like the steps that you as an individual can take without all that much effort or necessarily all that much expense. And recognize that if you and a bunch of your neighbors and a bunch of people across this province, across this country are taking those steps, that it can make a difference and it is worth doing.
I love that, Shannon. Thanks for reminding everybody not to be discouraged. I feel like sometimes we look at these problems at such a high level and it feels like it's impossible to really move the needle. But I think all of the stories you've written about do show, like, even in, you know, at the level of a single housing development, a single tiny First Nation, you can really start to shift not only the housing that people have access to, that they live inside every day, which is such a huge part of our lives, but just the solutions and ideas that are possible that others can adopt as well. So I think that's great. And my suggestion for everybody is to look up, you know, housing proposals in your own city. These are usually available if you go to your municipal government website. You can see what's being proposed, and it's a good way to just get a sense of what housing is being built near you. That's, again, I think the level of government where people have the most influence and the most opportunity to shape policy and have feedback on policy. So if that's something that's important to you, because I am seeing it as such a theme in these questions, you know, take a look at what's happening locally. I feel like it's a really good way to also remember that you do have power and influence as a citizen. So here's a great question that Lindsay, our BC Bureau Chief, has pulled out of the chat. What role do policymakers have in supporting tenants, homeowners, and builders from the cost of building new resilient homes and retrofitting existing ones? So it's kind of a question, you know, when you have these incremental cost increases, who should pay for those when you're only going to see the savings over a long period of time? Shannon, I see you thinking.
Yeah, that's like the $1 million question, right? And it comes up so much when we're talking about government policy, especially because many investments, you know, don't pay off until down the road. I don't know what the answer is there. I do know that, like, you know, the provincial government has more like they have more money, they have access to a larger tax base than do local governments, and the feds have like an order of magnitude higher. So that is one way of measuring where that responsibility lies. I think one of the things that we have to consider as a society is that, there is a lot of financial inequity in our society. And so people have different abilities to afford these kinds of upgrades. And investments that we really need. And it's a tough conversation because, some people say, well, if everybody pays the same amount, that's fair. But then if someone is earning considerably less than another person, that is a much larger chunk of their income and can have a much larger impact on the way they're able to live their lives. So I think that's an important question to ask and a discussion to have. I don't know where, like, I don't have the answers. I would be interested in finding ways to dig into them. One of the things I will say is that BC's policies around making sure that renters and rental homes are getting the same kinds of upgrades and things like making sure that temperatures are safe for people to live in, especially in older rental stock, or making sure that people can get the same kind of rebates for heat pumps, is something that we're only kind of starting to see steps taken on. The provincial government did recently expand the eligibility for heat pumps to rental units in like apartment buildings, but the landlord has to permit it, and they're the ones that get the rebate and would of course like retain the heat pump when the tenant moves out. So basically, if you're a tenant, you can approach your landlord and sort of like try and nudge them towards getting a heat pump, but they are the ones at the end of the day who have the power to make that decision, which is kind of a tricky thing to navigate when you're living in a home that may not have any kind of cooling system at all and not particularly efficient heating, etc.
Yeah, I appreciate that perspective so much because I think so much housing policy and decision making is really focused on owners as arguably a much more powerful kind of voting bloc that governments really campaign to. In Canada, 1/3 of Canadians are renters, and in major cities, really expensive cities like Vancouver, half of people are renters, and they do tend to be young people, seniors, far less available money to make these changes, a lot less power. So I think that's an important lesson that we should be pushing for solutions that consider the rights of renters as not subsidiary to the rights of owners or dependent on the largesse of owners to make these changes. So thanks for bringing that one in. Steph, do you have any thoughts to add on policy?
I don't think so. I also feel like Shannon did such a great job answering right there.
Steph's story on Heiltsuk touches on some of the historic inequities too that First Nations have dealt with when trying to build adequate housing on reserve. And I really encourage people to read it and also to click on some of the links that look at housing shortages in Heiltsuk, which are, I think, pretty representative of a lot of the housing issues on reserves in Canada. Housing in First Nations is funded differently than it is in other Canadian jurisdictions. It's historically been funded very unequally. And so, I mean, if you're interested in learning more about these challenges, I think it's a really great read to show that side of it as well.
Yeah, a whole bunch of unique challenges there. Updating funding or land available to reflect current populations, many of which were decided back when populations had been decimated by disease. And then also, reserves are really at risk of flooding and wildfires for a bunch of reasons because people were pushed to undesirable land, limited in their ability to manage that land. And now creating new reserves or moving reserves is a bureaucratic nightmare that can take decades and decades. So it is a whole other unique area with a lot of challenges. And then just the idea of if a certain like Heiltsuk is creating their own constitution, wanting to move away from the Indian Act, and then it's like that changes how they do every single thing day to day that right now in the band office is dictated by the Indian Act. So to move away from that is a whole other huge journey as well. So yeah, so many more unique challenges in that area.
Yeah. And a good reminder that housing is always kind of woven into these other bigger issues of governance, of energy policy, transportation policy, all of those things. We just have a couple minutes left. Steph and Shannon, do you have any last reflections you want to leave folks with or anything? I mean, I would love to hear if there's a housing and environment or housing and climate story that you'd like to see reported in the future, whether it's yours or not.
One thing that stuck out to me when going through the questions that people had submitted was people did have like very specific questions to their area that I wished we could really get into. And so I was wondering, like, oh, I wonder what kind of public service work we can do, maybe to gather resources for people. Like people are asking, like, how can I find out what the regulations are and like what's available and the if we could gather together the climate risks and the funding and like all that kind of stuff in a space for people and create that kind of resource, how cool that would be, the unique challenges, because like we said, they are different space to space, community to community. So I would love to see if that's something you could build over time to be able to direct people, because so often you're having to navigate all these annoying websites and convolute information in slightly different program names. You have to know exactly what to look for, and that's all really hard.
There's a few things. There's an ever evolving story list that I try to maintain for stuff that I want to get to in the future. One of the things I was curious about in actually both of the stories that I touched on is BC has rules around like ensuring homes are warm enough in the winter, but we don't really have much in the way of ensuring that they're cool enough. At other times, we are starting in the building code to have some requirements around like a maximum temperature, but those are quite limited from what I understand at the moment. So I'm curious about, sort of why that conversation isn't further along and what is being done to move it forward. I write about energy policy a lot these days, as most of our political reporters are doing. It seems like the political reporters in every bureau are spending a lot of time writing about energy policy in the past year or so. So I'm also really curious about emissions related to the building sector. It's an area that I don't think has got a ton of attention. So things like the embodied emissions of things like demolishing old concrete buildings, or when you're looking at a new building, you kind of have to take into account the emissions of, bringing those building materials to a site, the building materials themselves. Not only like how much energy is it going to take to heat and light and provide water to a home, but how much is it going to cost? Because that was something that came up during the reporting I was doing on social housing as a climate solution, is that you can add all these energy efficiency bells and whistles to a home, but you also need to keep in mind that the person who is only able to pay a highly subsidized rent may also have limited means to pay for, their power bills, and that even with these energy efficiency upgrades, sometimes those bills are a large burden on low income households. So I'm curious about the various policies that are going into one, evaluate, like, how do we even evaluate on a regular basis the true sort of emissions profile of various buildings? And what are we doing? What are the good policies for finding ways to lower those emissions?
Thank you, Shannon. I mean, I said that you two didn't have to propose stories that you would report, but I feel like you're the perfect reporter for those. So thanks to everybody for joining us today. We just have a minute left, so I'll wrap up here. Thank you for all of your incredible comments and questions on this. If you missed Eric's message in the chat, we will be sending out a link to the webinar recording and the transcript. So if you want to catch up on this discussion, if there's anything that you missed, you'll have that in your email tomorrow. And please do sign up for our weekly newsletter. There's a pop-up on every story on our website, so it's easy to find. It's the best way to find out what we're reporting on lately and see all of our newest stories. So please sign up for that. We send newsletters out every Thursday and some Saturdays. And also consider, if you're not already, joining our pod and becoming a Narwhal member. The Narwhal is a reader-supported publication. We can only tell these stories because of support from readers like you. It goes directly to our reporting, to filing FOIs, to reporting on the ground. It's hugely important. We are trying to get 150 new members this month. So if you're one of them and you join, we will send you that lovely tote bag. Let me show you again. Cute. Carries on
So
like
sturdy.
rocks and seashells. It's perfect for that, but for anything else too. So thanks again for being here with us today. We're so grateful for your time and your attention, and we hope to see you soon at a future Narwhal webinar or in the real world. Bye.